a revolutionary movement, peasant revolts. In England, the poll tax was collected 3 times between 1377 and 1381 to cover the increasing cost of the 100 Years' War. These taxes were a further burden on people already facing significant challenges. The peasants outright resisted the tax officers who came to Essex County at the end of May 1381, in defiance of the last tax decision. The rebellion then spread immediately to the south of England. The rebels, led by Wat Tyler and John Ball, took London by force. They held the city for 4 days. The rebels had not yet carried out any notable attacks. Once in London, the rebels showed no mercy, unleashing brutal violence against nobles and high-level church officials. These 2 classes were their primary targets. They demanded the abolition of all religious and social titles, as John Wycliffe had frequently voiced. In their meetings with the king in London, they demanded freedom and equality. King Richard II was forced to accept the demands of the peasants, who were in a strong position at that moment. However, the royal soldiers, who had later rallied, dispersed the rebels and harshly punished their leaders. This movement was a defining moment in English history, questioning the very social structure of the country. The loss of population following the plague epidemic that started in Europe in 1348 led to a sharp increase in labor wages, as there was a massive labor shortage. King Edward III was clear in his response: wages must be restored to their pre-pandemic level. He ordered the Parliament to do so. When this was not a permanent solution, the landowners used their influence in Parliament to ensure that workers' wages remained fixed. In 1351, a law, the Labor Law, prohibited the increase of workers' wages. It also forbade peasants from leaving their current masters and large farms. This decision forced the population to work for low wages, which caused serious unrest. The worker invoked this law when the seigneur demanded more wages. The worker would simply run away and find another land. The middle-level senators were affected by this shakeup, but the great barons were much more strengthened. While there was some minor public opposition to this law, there was no significant resistance at the time. This law was not the only issue affecting the people. Despite living on an island, they were still affected by the negative consequences of the 100 Years' War. The consequences were felt deeply. The 1370s were a bad decade for England. Aquitaine was defeated, and costly expeditions were undertaken with no results. Most damaging of all, French ships kept launching attacks on the British coast. The British government was woefully inadequate in taking precautions against these attacks. It is so widely believed to be the cause of the negativity experienced during this period that it is seen as the root cause. Wycliffe-sympathizing clergymen like William Swinderby remained in England throughout the war. They openly criticized the ongoing war. Similarly, in France, Philippe de Mézières, one of the king's closest advisors, was openly discussing these issues. This clearly indicates that the situation was primed for a social upheaval. John Wycliffe was the driving force behind the movement. He was born in Yorkshire in the 1330s. Wycliffe came from an Anglo-Saxon family. He studied mathematics and nature at Oxford University, but his main focus was Christian theology and philosophy. He died in Lutterworth in 1384. Thomas Walsingham, a writer of the period, states the following about John Wycliffe in his work. At Oxford University, he was a theologian from the north. A doctor named Master John Wycliffe began to attract attention. He was a perverted and absurd character who tried to spread his ideas publicly. He was attempting to overthrow the established order of the church. He was clear that the Roman Church was not the head of other churches and that it was no different from them. Likewise, the Pope in Rome was no more authoritative than any priest. Wycliffe was forthright in his criticism of the corrupt hierarchical church and forcefully argued that it had the means to return to its former purity. He was adamant that it had to be taken. The movement was gaining strength. Urbanites, merchants, landowners, owners, and even members of the lower clergy. Some knights from the royal family and members of the House of Commons were also on board. Later Lollards, a movement known for their controversial ideas, were also protected by John of Gaunt, whose palace had been sacked in the peasant uprising. Wycliffe was spared a very severe sentence at his trial in 1377 thanks to this. His defense of the king's sovereignty over the Roman Catholic Church in England was undoubtedly a factor. Wycliffe's ideas were not new. The Cathars in Languedoc, Valdoculaire, and the Pastoureaux all made similar demands in their uprisings. From 1380 onward, he was the primary critic of the church in English. This meant that ordinary people were also exposed to Wycliffe's ideas. Wycliffe called it degeneracy. Wycliffe did not stop there. A year later, he translated the Bible into English. The mobilization of these ideas, pioneered by Wycliffe, was carried out by one secularist and one cleric. Two figures, one from the secular class, were responsible for this. The one with a secular identity is the head. Wat Tyler demanded the abolition of taxes and feudal drudgery on the peasants. Tyler is widely claimed to be a Kentishman, but the people of Essex also claim that he was a native of their county and an urbanite. He was an urbanite because he came to the rebellion from Maidstone. Froissart states that he was a Tyler. It is also likely that he was an urban nobleman. I should also mention Jack Straw, who is often mentioned alongside Wat Tyler. Some people even claim that Tyler and Straw are one and the same person. Wat Tyler's rebellion against his daughter is reminiscent of William Wallace's letter to Edward III. In this story, Tyler's daughter is said to have been harassed by one of the collectors. John Ball, also known as the Mad Priest of the city, was a religious figure. He was the man who, from the 1360s onwards, from Yorkshire to Essex, he traveled through villages and towns, boldly proclaiming that people are equal, that the church is in control, and that land should be confiscated and distributed to landless peasants. He also conveyed these thoughts to much farther distances, through letters written in cipher. He was working. He was imprisoned multiple times for expressing these controversial views. Jean Froissart, one of the chroniclers of the period, states the following about him. From Sunday Mass, he would then gather a crowd around him as the congregation was leaving the church and say to them, "O people, the difference between master and serf will only be abolished when a joint decision is taken on the matter. Britain will not get better until this happens. They lord it over us, and we deserve it. They have no right to enslave us. We all come from the same parents, Adam and Eve. There is no reason why they should claim to be better masters than us. They wear velvets, silks, and furs, but we wear only simple cloth. They have wine, spices, and good bread. We have rye bread and only water to drink. While they sit in their beautiful homes, we work in the fields, in the rain and wind, in hardship. They have enjoyed their prosperity thanks to their labor. We are their servants. If we don't serve them, they'll beat us. We will complain to anyone who will listen. We're going to the king. He is young. We will tell him about our miserable lives. If he gets angry with us, we will find a solution together, according to the rules or otherwise." The Archbishop of Canterbury sent John Ball to Maidstone for 2 or 3 months until the end of the war, after hearing his account. Walsingham is clear that there were other rebel leaders, besides Wat Tyler and John Ball. These are John Kirkby, Alan Threader, Thomas Scott, Robert Westbourne, John Starling, and Ralph Rudge. The rebellion was triggered by the poll tax introduced to fund the 100 Years' War. This tax, first collected in 1377, was collected from 14 years of age without discrimination between rich and poor. Everyone was unequivocally and unfairly charged 1 groat, about a goat's worth of money. The government took action on the proposal of Thomas of Woodstock, Earl of Buckingham, in April 1379. Chevauchée was practiced in France to fund acts of looting and to levy a tax. This time, the tax was based on income. For example, knights and law enforcement officers would pay 5 groats, while salaried priests would pay 3. The lower age limit was also increased to 16. By 12th of December 1380, the head tax was demanded for the 3rd time. This time, the amount was tripled, and once more, it was unfair to plan to take 3 groats from everyone over the age of 15. This means the same as John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, or William Walworth, Mayor of London. They would pay the amount. In the spring of 1381, when the tax collection began, the tax collectors immediately noticed something strange. Despite the absence of any major catastrophe since 1377, the number of agricultural workers or shepherds had decreased by approximately 500,000. The numbers speak for themselves. The earldom of Kent fell from 56,557 to 43,838. Somerset from 54,604 to 30,384. Devon from 45,635 to 20,656. The national figure fell from 1,355,201 to 896,481, which is a significant decline. This was not the case. It was a form of tax evasion or, for some, passive resistance. In response, the government launched a campaign of arrests to find these disappeared villagers and appointed special investigating officers with the power to punish. John de Bampton was appointed as an investigating officer on 31st May 1381. He was in charge of a team that was sent to Essex. The townspeople of Brentwood welcomed him. When Constable John de Bampton ordered the arrest of the resisting peasants, the peasants arrested him and forced other officers out of Brentwood. Things were spiraling out of control, and the whole of Essex was in uproar. The peasants demanded freedom and equality with their masters. The rebellion spread rapidly to the south of England. Kent villages and towns in the county began making similar demands to Essex on 5th of June, having been informed of developments in the north. On 2nd June, a rebel group was formed in Kent by a man named Abel Kerr. This name is recorded. There is no further information about the Maidstone and Dartford. On 7th June, Maidstone and Dartford took action in their towns. This time, Wat Tyler led the charge. This is the first time it is mentioned in recorded history. On 8th of June, public office records were destroyed in Kent, and in Maidstone, the prison was emptied. John Ball, imprisoned since April by order of the Archbishop, was released. These rebels were part of the Jackery Rebellion, as well as unorganized and itinerant peasant gangs. This is incorrect. Many of the British rebels were experienced soldiers who had fought in France. One of their leaders, Wat Tyler, had undoubtedly fought in France. Jack Straw from Essex, Wat Tyler and his men were next on the move, marching from Kent to London. The rebels advanced in small groups, uniting into a huge crowd as they went. Peasants were at the heart of the rebellion. But later on, wage laborers and artisans were also involved. Even the lower clergy, those from the very class that rebelled against the selfishness of the rich and the vices prevalent in the church, have come out. Tyler boldly led the main group into England on 10th of June, overcoming no resistance whatsoever. They made their way southeast of Canterbury. From that moment on, the rebellion became violent. They looted the diocesan headquarters, but Archbishop Sudbury was in London at the time. Then they piled up tax offices, court records, and other documents in the streets and burned them. The rebels continued their advance and reached London on 11th of June. By this time, they numbered 10,000 and had found it. Froissart puts the figure at 60,000, while Walsingham and the Anonymal Chronicle claim it was over 100,000. The rebels have been in their previous location and have emptied the prisons in London. Archbishop Simon Sudbury's Lambeth Palace was sacked. In a bold move, King Richard II sought refuge at the Tower of London on June 12th. Despite the chaos surrounding him, the rebels stormed the city in two columns. The Kentish group, led by Wat Tyler, crossed the Thames and reached Blackheath, Southwark, and Lambeth on the night of 12th of June. John Ball arrived on the morning of 13th of June. In Blackheath, he delivered a powerful speech that included the famous rhyme, "When Adam was digging in the earth and Eve was spinning wool, was there a gentleman?" A group of Essex people from North London entered the city and joined the townspeople. The London mayor, William Walworth, was forced to admit that he was powerless to close the city's gates when he saw the rebels advancing. The townspeople prevented this by siding with the rebels. Once the rebels had entered the city, they were swiftly organized into three groups, which were concentrated in one area. The first is Highbury in the north of London, and the second is further east. Mile End was the second area, and Tower Hill was the third, both on the east side. On 13th of June, representatives of the rebels and the king met at Rotherhithe. King Richard, arriving by boat at the meeting place, cancelled the meeting and did not disembark, citing concerns for his own safety. By then, the rebellion had been relatively bloodless. The peasant army was on its way to London. They looted provincial offices, burned land and birth certificates, besieged castles. They did not attack the inhabitants. The king's refusal to meet with them led to an escalation of violence. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, and the rebels advanced towards the city center. They took the Savoy Palace of John of Gaunt and looted it. Walsingham stated that this palace was the most beautiful building in England at that time. The destruction of this palace was undoubtedly a symbolic gesture. This was not about extortion. As a matter of fact, they did not take the gold and silver they had captured. Instead, they smashed it and threw it into the Thames. They also burned the Temple Bar, which belonged to the Knights Hospitaller and was frequented by the wealthy in the city. The fire also destroyed many records. Newgate released the prisoners and burned the records. They stormed the Temple Church and burned books and old furniture. These burnings were not just indiscriminate destruction. They were a deliberate act of vandalism, aimed at destroying their records. The Dutch were particularly brutal, killing many people, especially foreigners. Froissart stated that Tyler himself had killed Richard Lyons, the renowned Dutch moneylender. He struck himself because in France, when he worked under Richard Lyons, he was forced to do so. It is highly likely that their domestic trade rivals were behind the killing of the Dutch. Local merchants reacted with resentment because the Dutch merchants had a very strong place in the commercial life of England at that time. Let me be clear, there have been many personal problems over the last 2 years. John of Gaunt meets with the rebels in Greenwich and makes another appointment with the king. On 14th June, representatives of the rebels, led by King Richard and Wat Tyler, marched to the Mile. They met at the end. The rebels demanded the abolition of serfdom and made many other demands. The king accepted their demands and forgave them for their crimes. This was followed by many insurgents, taking the freedom papers hastily drawn up by royal clerks and returning to their villages. Another rebel group from St. Albans was among those who came here. They seized the opportunity to settle old scores with the monastery. They were mobilized. The city boundaries were redrawn, pastures, fishing grounds, and hunting grounds were redefined. Places were freed, and the ban on building handmills was lifted. The most important demand was for the abbot of the monastery, Richard of Wallingford, to return the promissory notes he had extorted from their fathers. They approached Tyler and demanded that he support them in realizing these demands. Their plans included the destruction of Monaster. They also demanded that the king had given them a positive answer. Meanwhile, the rebel group on Tower Hill had overpowered the guards and entered the Tower of London. They came here and executed many senior officials who had taken refuge on the spot as traitors. The first to be executed was Archbishop Sudbury. It is said that 8 axes were used to strike Sudbury's neck. The first blows were landed. As the first blows landed, Sudbury bravely held his wound with his free hand, determined to keep working. Sudbury's ordeal did not end with his death. No one was allowed to work for him, and no one dared to bury his body. The rebels took his head, placed it on a pole, and paraded it through the streets. The second name was John Legge, a member of the Franciscan order and head tax collector. The third to be executed was the treasurer and a hospital, Richard Hales, master of the Order of the Knights. Needless to say, the executions did not end there. Many British and Dutch dignitaries were killed. The rebels grew more reckless and entered the Queen's chamber. Walsingham states that they were lying on the king's bed and joking around. Some of them even went so far as to ask the king's mother to kiss them. While all this was going on, Richard Henry Bolingbroke, cousin and son of John of Gaunt, who would also become the next king, Henry Bolingbroke IV, was also in the Queen's chamber. On the evening of 14th of June, Richard returned to the tower to find the city in flames. The rioters stated emphatically that those imprisoned for debts had opened the gates of Fleet Prison and freed the prisoners. it was evident that immediate action was necessary. But the question remained: how and when? The next day, the day before Richard met the rebels, he went to Westminster Abbey to confess and pray. This time, the meeting place was Smithfield, on the north side of London. Here, Richard and Wat Tyler decided to meet face to face. Tyler left his followers and went straight to the king. Before he left, he ordered his followers to remain calm and not to cause any trouble until he gave the signal. He also instructed them to kill everyone except the king. Tyler began his speech by calling the king "my brother" and proceeded to make even more demands. He listed them with confidence. Firstly, during Edward III's reign, he demanded that the landowners, the peasants who worked the land, be given more power over the Church of England by repealing the laws that had been passed to give them this power. The entire Church of England will be confiscated and its wealth distributed to the people. All bishops will be demoted, and only John Ball could bear the title. Serfdom would be abolished, and everyone would be free and equal. In parallel, all ranks and titles of the British aristocracy were to be abolished. These demands signaled the end of the feudal structure that had existed since the Norman invasion. The rebels were on their way. Tyler's disrespectful behavior and excesses notwithstanding, the king remained unyielding in his refusal to concede to the rebels' demands. The sources of the period provide conflicting accounts of what happened next. Widespread, Tyler wanted to celebrate this agreement. He asked for water or beer, and in the presence of the king, drank it while shaking it. In the process, a conversation began, either spontaneously or planned, and it quickly turned into a scuffle. One of those present called Tyler the biggest thief in the country and shouted. Tyler then produced a knife and advanced on the individual, but was prevented from doing so by the London mayor, William Walworth, who attempted to arrest him. Tyler attacked him with a knife, but William was in armor and he failed. William Walworth then told Tyler, "When you retaliate, you will wound him in the neck and kill him." It was a significant shock to the system, but on the other hand, it gave the king and his nobles hope against the rebels and encouragement. The rebel villagers were infuriated by Tyler's death. They joined forces and fought with unwavering determination to avenge their fallen leader. They were out of control, and that's when Richard II told the peasants, "I am your king." What are you doing? You don't want that. You're upset over the death of a traitor. I am your leader and your king. I will fulfill your wishes. Follow me. He then led them away from the scene and organized a more organized group in Clerkenwell, in the center of the city. He took them and drove them away from London, as well as the mayor, William Walworth, and the Duke of Brittany, Robert. This would give Knowles time to recruit. And so it was. William Walworth gave a rousing speech on the streets of London. "I am your mayor. Our king is in danger. Every God-fearing man must follow me immediately to help him. Follow me. Even if you don't like your king," he stated firmly. In this way, he had recruited about 1,000 well-armed men. Robert Knowles had also gathered a considerable force of men. He then used these men to lay siege to the square where it was located. The rebels, realizing the gravity of the situation, began to disperse. Nevertheless, Walsingham asserts that 100 or 200 rebels were killed at this time. Meanwhile, the St. Albans rioters were caught in a difficult situation as the wind turned against them. They took the decisive action of hiring an expensive lawyer to settle things with the abbot. Furthermore, they caused significant damage and even replaced the millstones they dismantled with new ones that they had provided. The rebels dispersed, but in the meantime, the king kept his word and proved his sincerity when he promised them at Smithfield that he would do so. As the days passed, it became clear that King Richard had no intention of keeping his word. He was not going to do so. He outright canceled all the promises he had made at Mile End and Smithfield. The rebels rose up again, but the British army had recovered and was ready for them. Punishments were introduced. London was secure, but Essex and Kent were not. This is why an army under the king himself set out and arrived at Waltham in Essex on 22nd June, Walsingham's estimate of 40,000 troops is clearly an exaggeration. Other sources put the number at around 2,000. As Richard prepared for a retaliatory attack, a delegation appeared before the king. Walsingham stated that they were prepared to risk even their lives. Yet surprisingly, they demanded that the king fulfill his promises. They demanded an end to serfdom and to be on an equal footing with the lords. Once more, Walsingham was astounded by their courage. Richard responded to them thus: "You wretched people have no right to live on land or sea. I have decided to obey the right of the embassy. If I hadn't, I would have punished you by killing you in the worst way possible. If you can convey the messages I'm going to tell you now to the rebels in the right way, I will spare your life. You were peasants, and you will remain peasants. Your lives will be far worse than before. By God's grace, you will survive, as long as we rule this kingdom. We will keep you in disgraceful conditions as long as it takes for us to succeed. People will curse you now and in the future. We will make them see your misery so that they will be afraid to commit similar crimes themselves." The envoys delivered their message. The people surrendered, but the king's troops of knights killed about 500 rebel villagers at various points along the way. He also seized their horses. Meanwhile, the townspeople were preparing to reunite and revolt. Richard was not happy. He was furious and decided to solve the problem once and for all. He and many other prominent townspeople left for another place. Some dignitaries stepped in and he backed down. Nevertheless, he was not afraid to launch a major prosecution. The mayor of London, William Walworth, was now also given the power to judge. He used these broad powers to launch prosecutions of the rebels not only in London but in many other places, including Kent, Essex, Sussex, Norfolk, and Suffolk. Amnesty was granted for all except those who led the rebellion, including John Ball. Jack Straw, John Kirkby, Alan Threader, and John Starling were executed as a result. John Starling proudly proclaimed that he had beheaded Archbishop Sudbury, who had suffered the same fate. The Welsh jurist and chronicler Adam Usk, who lived in the 14th century, definitively states, "The king and the lords followed them. They dragged some behind horses, put others to the sword, hanged some on gallows, and quartered the rest. They killed thousands of them." Robert Knowles captured John Ball, who was attempting to flee the scene. He was taken to Coventry. They then took him to St. Albans. In St. Albans, he was brought before a perfunctory tribunal presided over by Robert Tressilian and sentenced to death. The sentence was passed. The execution was an extreme measure, common in the 13th and 14th centuries. It was carried out in a brutal way. John Ball was dragged away and executed in the street. He was then publicly hanged in the city square, and on 15th of July, his head was severed and his internal organs were removed. He was finally cut into 4 pieces. This form of execution was not limited to John Ball. His close associates and 10 of his men, including William Grindecob, William Caddington, and John the Barber, were also executed. 5 gang leaders were executed in the same way. King Richard was able to recover the bodies of the rebels and hang them for as long as possible. The objective was clear: to strike fear into those who would oppose the king. The executions and arrests continued until August. In November, the king demanded a general amnesty from Parliament. Meanwhile, the Lollards also suffered persecution and punishment. The Lollards openly condemned those who participated in the uprising, but their peasants were also persecuted in the forests and hunting preserves of the feudal lords. They were punished for spreading ideas that encouraged them not to recognize property rights. The Lollards were now unequivocally branded as enemies of the social order. Conclusion: the ostensible cause of this rebellion was the cost of the 100 Years' War, which had been going on off and on for 40 years. The government could not afford it and wanted to project this onto the public. The real factor behind the incident, the aristocratic class taking Parliament with it, has consistently tried to restrict the rights of the peasants. Work. This is why the first spark of the rebellion started with resistance to the tax officials. But it aimed to abolish the domination of the aristocracy over the people. It is important to remember that the rebellion was not against the king, but against the feudal order. As a matter of fact, Wat Tyler. He also gave warnings to his entourage not to come. In the end, it is seen that the rebellion, it can be said to have failed. However, this event did not lead to the abolition of class segregation in British society. Has been an important step. This theoretical infrastructure was formed with the influence of the libertarian and egalitarian views that increased with the Renaissance. The rebellion had demands far ahead of its time. As a matter of fact, the writers and writers of the period who were witnesses of the events chroniclers either overly criticized or ignored this rebellion. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer and William Shakespeare, important literary figures of the period, included the subject in their works. They did not. Moreover, it was not until the 19th century that there was a significant positive approach to this event. It didn't happen.